spend my nights out in ballroom. Liquor was the only love I'd known. But you rescued me from reaching for the bottom and brought me back, being too far gone. You're as smooth as Tennessee whiskey. You're as sweet as strawberry wine. You're as warm as a glass of brandy.
Man, I love that song. Great song. Benny Cruz, outstanding job. With that said, we want to welcome Big BJ Juarez all the way from Long Beach. Beautiful scripture, brother. Proverbs 16:7. We got San Diego PD, Team 4 legend, Christopher Kilby, and we have our Big Joe all the way from Salinas, California. Saludos, gentlemen, from Salinas. And we got last night's guest on the Gray Line, Roger Demshock. Brother, you batted it out of the park, brother. It was an outstanding show last night. If you guys get a chance, watch last night's show. Now, watching that show, you'll know why Roger Demshock, former gang detective with the San Diego Sheriffs, is the legend that he is. We have Ceci. Saludos para todos. We saw you there last night, Ceci. We got VP 760s all the way from Imperial, Valle Imperial, Imperial Valley. Anthony Garcia watching us all the way from Modesto. Welcome, brother. And we have Jerónimo de los Cielos. Jerónimo, beautiful email you sent me today. Thank you very much, brother. And last but not least, we'll continue later because we have a lot of great things to talk about. John Mueller, good evening. Typing, man. Hey, good evening, brother. Man, brothers, I'm excited about today. We're excited that you're with us, George. But before we introduce you, we do our routine. And Bobby, we'll start off with you, brother.
Hey, thanks everyone for joining us. Today, I'm excited about this show either. We don't have a lot of MS13 out here in Arizona, so I always love listening to someone talk about them that has worked them, although I've been in contact with them in other places. But right now, normally I like smoking more of a powerful full-body cigar, but today I'm smoking the Connecticut Oliva. You can see it right here. Oh, there it is.
Great stuff, man.
It's more of a milder one. It's very smooth. Yeah. I love it. And I decided I'm going to smoke that. And I just got a new bottle of whiskey. It's called Mills and Mash. The guy at the store that I go to recommended it. He never done me wrong. And I want to be drinking this right here. It's a small
Are you drinking it straight, Bobby, or with a little bit of water, or you're on ice?
A little bit of ice. Just
a little bit of ice, right? Cool. Yeah.
So it's a small batch Kentucky straight bourbon. So that's what I'm going to have.
Hey, brother, I was outside already set up, but we're having some power surges here in Apollo Beach. So I ran upstairs. So I made me an old-fashioned. I got one of my favorite drinks, an old-fashioned, and I'm using that Willet rye that I bought last week at Costco. I'll tell you, for the old-fashioned, drinking it, last week I drank it with ice, a little bit of water. It just didn't hit it. But right now, making it on my old-fashioned, I'm telling you, it's hitting the spot, man. It's hit without a doubt. Willet, salud. And our guest today, George Norris. What are you drinking, brother?
Drinking the expensive Miller Lite.
Right on.
Okay, cool. That's cool.
Not Bud Light, Miller Lite.
Yeah, you're drinking something with us. Hey, guests, those of you that are watching, tell us what you're drinking. Hopefully you're drinking. If you're smoking a cigar, tell us what cigar, and we'll go ahead and announce it here. But with that said, guys, before we get started, I want to wish Alec. Today, Doug's not with us because he's celebrating his son's birthday. He has two sons. One of his sons that lives with him, I believe, up in North Carolina. Today, they're celebrating his birthday. Happy birthday, Alec, on behalf of Ash Wednesday. Feliz cumpleaños. Hey, guys, let's give him a toast. Feliz cumpleaños. Very happy birthday. Delicious. Guys, let's get started, man. I'm excited. It's going to be a great show. Glad to see another gringo.
Gringon. It's a gringon.
Chingon, a gringon.
Like a regular gringo, but más chingon.
Oh, exactly, man. That's a cool shirt, brother. Hey guys, today we're honored to have the president of the International Latino Gang Investigators Association. I'll tell you, those of you that work gangs or that work gangs in the past, you could still become members. During the show, I'll put up their website where you could log on. It's an outstanding organization, and I'm sure George is going to talk a little bit about it. He's the president. I believe he's been the president for the past 3 years. But George is a retired detective sergeant with 28 and a half years of experience working at Prince George's County Police Department in Maryland. And he has a lot of experience. He's an expert, has testified over 55 times in Superior Court, and not only in Superior Court, but in federal court on MS13 cases. Those of us, and we're going to be touching on Brenda Paz, that case that President Donald Trump mentioned during his presidency. That's where he brought MS13 to light. He didn't work on the case, but he was probably one of the experts on the case. It was right across the river where his police department is. So he had his hands in the investigation, and he's going to break it down for us as we go on today's episode. But brother, listen, we want to hear you. We don't want to hear me. Thank you for being on our show. Welcome, brother. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here. I appreciate it.
And we'll start off. Bobby, let's start off with the first question, brother.
You know, anytime we have somebody on here, we like them to give us a little bit of who are you, where did you start, how did you get into law enforcement, and a little bit about your experience. Take it from there.
Right on. So I was born as a police officer, is what I tell people. My father was a police officer for, I think, well over 50 years, actually. In 1966 or 67, he started on the Prince George's County Police Department, and then I was born right after that. So I was raised in a police household, and growing up, I had two passions. One was law enforcement, you know, being a police, because that's what my dad was, and I thought it was cool. And the other was animal rescue, and I wanted to, you know, I watched Mutual of Omaha, Wild Kingdom every week, you know, that and Disney. And I wanted to be one of the guys out there wrestling alligators and helping animals or like a dolphin trainer, until I realized that those people aren't just like people like me that just go out and grab animals and get bit if they get bit, like stuntmen. They were actually marine biologists and scientists and doctors. And that was way too much school for me. So in 1989, I had a couple years of college, and I joined up with the Prince George's County Police Department. I have 4 younger brothers, 2 of which are police officers, and I was married to a police officer for 10 years, to a Latina, a Puerto Rican. So I learned a lot of the culture, Latino culture, from her. A lot of the words, a lot of the bad words, but I learned the difference between, you know, Guatemalans and Salvadorans, and her dad was Puerto Rican and mom was Guatemalan. So, you know, I learned that everybody's not Mexican, which unfortunately a lot of people think everybody's Mexican. You speak Mexican? What do you mean? What do you mean? Well, he was Mexican. Well, how do you know he was Mexican? Because he was speaking Mexican. All right, whatever. So I started learning about the culture, and then through '89, I got promoted. I worked in our district narcotics unit, like a jump team, community policing, in patrol for a while. Got promoted to sergeant, and then in 2002, December of 2002, we had a string of robberies on Christmas Eve, and ultimately, long story short, MS13 ended up doing those robberies. So at that point, I knew we needed a gang unit. We did not have a gang unit. So I talked to my command staff, and ultimately that's when the beginning of the gang unit for Prince George's County Police Department started. And it's just been an experience from there.
Hey, George, prior to those burglaries, did you guys have gangs? Did you guys have Crips, Blood, Sureños there, or Latin Kings? That's over there, Chicago area.
Yeah.
Did you have those in your city?
So in the Washington metropolitan area, there, the Bloods, the Crips, most of the major national gangs have some presence, including OMGs, motorcycle gangs, and all. But the majority of the gangs that we had in the area are all neighborhood-based gangs. So whatever neighborhood, whatever 2 or 3 block neighborhood you're from, you could get together with your friends, and that's what you would call yourself. And that's pretty much all we had. And they really weren't looked at. They really weren't paid attention to. Again, before 2002, we'd never had a gang unit. One of the things that interested me in gangs and turned me on to gangs was the movie Colors. I thought that was the coolest shit I'd seen in a long time, and I really liked, the way that the older officer associated with the gangs. He wasn't their friends, but he wasn't their enemies. It was kind of a mutual respect kind of thing between him and the gangs, and I liked that, and kind of tried to model my career after that. Later on, I met Tony Moreno, Pac-Man, who the story came from, so that was interesting as well. He's one of my mentors, actually.
Well, here we have a picture of you. I don't know if this is El Salvador, Honduras, or Guatemala, but and it looks like you look like Chapo Guzman, and it looks like they just captured you, taking you back to Mexico. But you're definitely not Chapo. But so after that burglary series in 2002, the gang unit, how did you get involved with MS13? How did you become an expert? And I think Bobby's going to get into more of the history. But before he asks you those questions about the history and so forth, tell us how you became an expert or involved investigating MS13.
So, again, in December 2002, we had that string of robberies. We ultimately started looking at all these different violent crimes that had happened, and realized that, holy crap, it's this same group that's doing multiple murders, rapes, robberies. We started talking to some high school kids, because a lot of our issues were with the younger kids, and we ultimately started getting information about the numbers of how many quote-unquote MS-13 members there were. And at that point, we didn't even know what MS-13 really was. So we started learning about MS-13 basically on the job training. We would go out, we would find them, we would talk to them, we would get more information. And within 4 months, we had so much crime that not only was in our jurisdiction, but was regional, at least, that the department asked to form a federal gang task force. So in 2003, like April 2003, the ATF agreed to create a gang task force, and it was called the RAGE, which is Regional Area Gang Enforcement Task Force, and they concentrated on MS-13. They assigned us an agent. We had other agents that were working with us, and also a U.S. attorney, which was interesting to me because I'm used to dealing with our county prosecutors, but I've never dealt with U.S. attorneys before. The U.S. attorney very early on basically told me, and I'm glad I listened to her. Her name was Sandy Wilkinson. She said, "You need to document all the training you've had, all the training you get, all the training that you do and you receive, and keep track of everything you learn, as well as learn about this gang. Ask people about the gang, because you need to become an expert on the gang." So she kind of prompted me and one other person to do that. I listened to her. That's why you see the CV that I have. I've been doing that. I stopped after COVID. It kind of cuts off after COVID, so there's some entries that aren't in there. But for years, since 2003, I have been keeping that thing going, updating it to every training I've done, every training I've received, every training I've been to, every prosecution I've testified in as an expert. And just through interviews, through watching them, through studying them, through talking to them, through investigating them, through locking them up, I just learned more and more about the gang. And, the Gringon became an expert on a Hispanic gang.
Go ahead, Bobby.
Yeah, here in Phoenix, we had a guy, I'll throw a shout out to him. I don't know if he's listening or will listen. Clint Davis was one of our gang experts. He was a Gringon. Dude he knew a lot about Miami. When we did the Mexican Mafia prison gang story, him and Armando Soldate, who another star we had out here. But he was just a good investigator. Clint, although he didn't speak Spanish, he was a hell of an investigator. And he was one of those guys where you go, if someone ever killed me, I'd want him to be investigating my case because I know he would never stop. A little bit about the history. I know like we had here in Arizona, we heard as a Phoenix cop, California was getting hammered with MS13 up in the Bay Area, LA, even a little bit in San Diego. We just didn't really have them. They would pass through and they were gone. 2 times they tried to set foothold here, but the local illegal alien street gang, which were all Mexican, just kicked them out because we don't get a lot of Salvadorans. We don't get a lot of Central Americans. Phoenix is primarily Mexican. We don't get Salvis. We don't get, as they call each other, bichos. We don't get them here. So how did, if you can give us a little history, besides, I know you covered some of it. And give us a little.
Hey, Bobby, before he answers, let me tell you about San Diego. During my career, I did 27, 28 years, San Diego PD, not once. And during those 27 years, I probably worked about 6, 7 years in gangs, either as a GST, gang suppression team officer, or as a detective sergeant. Yeah, about 7, 8 years. Not once did we ever see MS13 in San Diego. We had heard that they had gone to Chicano Park and they got the shit beat out of them there. We had heard that they had gone to Pozole, but never once did we ever see one in San Diego. So it was just like you up in Phoenix. They would get there and they would immediately leave to LA, and that's where you start right there, George.
Yes, exactly. Because here they would not last. The Mexican gangs did not like the Central Americans, and they stood out. They really stand out. They look like they make down south.
Yeah,
it's funny. Before I talk about the history, you mentioned that your friend, was it David? Is a friend that's the gang investigator. Who was the gang investigator from Phoenix?
The Gringon.
Clint
Davis. Okay. So you said he didn't speak Spanish, and that reminds me of something that happened as I'm testifying. I'd been married to a Latina for 10 years. I worked in a Hispanic community for over 20 years at this point, and I'm testifying as an expert on MS13. My testimony was that the majority of them speak Spanish. The defense attorney, who is Spanish, is cross-examining me and basically asking me, so have you had any formal training in the Spanish language? No. Are you fluent in Spanish? No. Now, I can read it. I can understand it. Y'all can talk Spanish, and I can tell you what you're talking about. I might miss a word. My vocabulary is limited speaking it, but I just don't consider myself fluent. And he basically said, so you expect the jury and I to believe that you're an expert on a gang that you said speaks MS13 or speaks predominantly Spanish, when you in fact have had no training in the Spanish language. You're not fluent in Spanish. Is that correct? And my response was, do experts on elephants speak elephant? Because you don't have to speak the language. You study them. You watch how they move when the police roll by, how they act when enemies roll by, how they walk, how they talk, how they respond, how they dress. Everything about them is what you study. So and that goes back to how I became an expert. I studied them. I paid attention to everything that they did, and I didn't want to know, okay, they do this, or they call this rank such and such. Well, why do they use that word? Why do they do it that way? I always asked why, because I wanted to know more about what they're doing. So, try not to be too long-winded with the history, but when you're looking at gangs like MS13, you have to look at California, and you look at Los Angeles. So at one point in time, you had Chicano gangs. Now, Chicano gangs the majority of them didn't allow Mexican immigrants or any other immigrants or any non-Chicano, which is Mexican-American, non-Chicano person to join their gangs. So you had, gangs like Alpine Street, you had the black gangs, you had other gangs that are in the area. But in the Pico Union area, the Rampart area of Los Angeles, you didn't have anything other than Chicano gangs, black gangs, and white gangs. Not very many white gangs. So when you had immigrants come up, they were preyed on by these gangs. At one point in the late 50s, early 60s, you had some brothers, the Glover brothers, that formed a gang called 18th Street. And when they formed that gang, they were actually not Hispanic. They're Eastern European, if I'm correct. But when they formed that gang, they allowed anybody in. So everybody could join 18th Street, which is the reason why 18th Street grew into the largest dominant active gang in the Los Angeles area, because they weren't restrictive on who they allowed in. In the early 80s, you had the Civil War going on in El Salvador, and you had a large number of immigrants coming up from El Salvador, and they went to the Pico Union area of Los Angeles. Now, another large portion went to the Washington, D.C. area. They went to other areas of the country, but a large portion went to the Pico Union area of Los Angeles. When they went there was gangs that were preying on them. So you had 18th Street that preyed on the immigrants. You had the Chicano gangs that preyed on them. And the only gang that they could join as Central American immigrants was 18th Street. So some joined 18th Street, which is why in South America, 18th Street, in Central America, 18th Street is one of the two dominant gangs throughout Central America, because that's the only gang at that point that they could join. Later on, you had the Salvadoran immigrants that formed together for protection and formed what ultimately is known as Mata Salvatrucha, or MS13. Now, when they first formed, they were they emulated what they saw, which was heavy metal, rock and roll, long hair, AC/DC, Black Sabbath, Quiet Riot T-shirts. The only place they could hang out was on rooftops, because that was the only safe place for them. And they, through time, ultimately evolved into your classic Southern California Latino street gang with their looks and their operation. When they first started, it was just Mata Salvatrucha, which I'll talk about the name in a second. And then ultimately they were forced to add the number 13 on. The 13 is indicative of their Sureño alliance, their membership in the Sureño alliance, and their being subservient to the Mexican mafia, which is the prison gang that controls all Sureño or Southern street gangs in California and other places as well. The name Mata Salvatrucha, Mata in the Spanish language, it's used more in Central America, but it just means gang or group. It doesn't necessarily mean like illegal street gang, though. When I first started working the MS13, I was told that Salvatrucha, you break it down from Salva, which is referring to El Salvador, and Trucha, which is look out or watch out. So you kind of put it together and it'd be like the gang that looks out or watches out for El Salvador, or look out or watch out for the gang from El Salvador. Many years later, talking to Nelson Arriaga, who's the current I don't think he's president. He's like executive director or something of the California Gang Investigators. He worked Inglewood, but he grew up in the area that MS13 formed. And he said that growing up, the Chicano street gangs referred to the Salvadorans as salvatruchas. You know, you're nothing but a salvatrucha. You're a dirty salvatrucha, as a derogatory term. And that Mara Salvatrucha used that derogatory term, salvatrucha, similar to how the 1% outlaw motorcycle gangs took that 1% that was a derogatory term or derogatory indicator, because there was only 1%, according to American Motorcycle Association, only 1% of the motorcycle riders were the bad guys, the outlaws, the gangsters. They took that 1% as a badge of honor. Well, Mara Salvatrucha basically took that word, salvatrucha, the derogatory word used by the Chicano gangs, as a badge of honor. And you know what? We are salvatruchas. We're Mara Salvatrucha. And they use that as a badge of honor. So that is my opinion of what the name means and where it originated from, as opposed to breaking it down.
That's very similar to what happened here. Here in Phoenix, the illegal alien Mexican gangs that showed up here in Phoenix, eventually the derogatory term for the illegal went back. So they took a name which they later became the largest by number street gang in Phoenix. They took the name Wetback Power. And then they broke into so many different sets that were at war with each other. Some groups were from Sonora, some were from Sinaloa, some were from Chihuahua, and all this. But they did the same thing, because at first, the Chicano gangs were calling them wetbacks, mojados. So
right.
They just it as, hey, yeah, we are. And they later became the largest street gang by number, and at times by violence as well. But want to go into...
Hey, Bobby, the wetbacks, what they're called, did they migrate over to Texas, to New Mexico? Because I've never heard that gang set in California. Do you know if they migrated over? I mean, just like right now, we're going to get into how this MS13 migrated. Did those wetback gang, did they migrate over to Texas, New Mexico?
Not that I know of, as an operating set. Now, what happened with them? They became so large in Arizona, they ended up becoming. They got classified as a security threat group within the Department of Corrections because there were so many of them, and they formed out of protection because the Mexican American street gangs, you know, all the inner city schools at one time had a set of wetback power. They would form as protection for the Chicano gangs that were always, you know, thumping them. Well, eventually, the hunted become the hunters because there were so many. In working gangs, and even as an undercover guy, I worked numerous undercover cases where I was buying stolen cars, stolen guns off of They also call themselves WBP or La Doble for W. So they call themselves WBP, La Doble, or Wetback Power. But anyway, they became the hunters. They went into a lot of our black neighborhoods and ran the black gangs out and set a foothold in some of the traditional black street gang areas and moved them out of there. That's how many, because we have a problem here, obviously, with the illegal immigration. So they were out of control.
Yeah. Hey, George, going back to you, tell us how did this gang set start in LA, and how did they migrate? I mean, why did they come south to San Diego? Why didn't they go to Arizona? How did they migrate to Maryland? How did they migrate to Baltimore, to the East Coast?
So the way that they ultimately migrated is with the Central American population. I mean, it's pretty simple. An example would be Tennessee. Tennessee didn't have any MS-13, any Central American gang presence. But Tennessee had a brand new football team known as the Tennessee Titans, and they were building a stadium. Well, who's doing a lot of the labor in the stadium? Central American immigrants. So you had a Central American immigrant population that went to that area specifically to work on that stadium. Ultimately, they stayed there. And while they stayed there, when that population goes there, the criminal element follows that population. If you have a bunch of Vietnamese in your area, you're going to have a Vietnamese criminal element within that population. If you don't have any Vietnamese, you don't have any Vietnamese criminal element in that area. So wherever the immigration brought the Central Americans, the criminal element followed and predominantly preyed on their own population unless provoked or confronted by a rival gang. So when they first started in Los Angeles, we basically deported the issue back to Central America. In Central America, years ago, they had local gangs, that were present, but they had nothing like MS13, nothing like 18th Street. When we started deporting these gangsters back to Central America, the kids down there, the gang members down there, were like, "Wow, look at how they dress. Look at how they're dressing with the cholo look and the rules and the regulations and the structure. And well, you're a real gangster from Los Angeles." And they started learning and following the Los Angeles pattern down in Central America, and then ultimately came back up north. And as they came back up north, they went to wherever their friends or family or associates were located, which is where the Central American populations were, the majority of which was the Washington metropolitan area and the Los Angeles area very early on. And then you see basically hubs of this Central American population with basically hubs of MS13 forming throughout the country. So you have Providence, Rhode Island, you have East Boston, you have Central New Jersey, you have the Bronx, New York, you have the Washington metropolitan area, you have Nashville, Tennessee, you have North and South Carolina, you have the Atlanta, Georgia area, you have the New Orleans area, and a very big hub that a lot of people will say they came through is the Houston area, because the majority of immigrants, not just gang members, but just general immigrants that come into the country that are coming to the East Coast or coming through central United States and the East, are going to come through the border south of Houston, Texas, along the Texas border, usually the Rio Grande Valley area. That's where they're coming into the country. If they're going to California, they take a totally different route, usually through Mexico, and enter the country through Arizona, usually, or Southern California, when they come into the country.
Well, I'll tell you, George, International Latino Gang Investigation Association, you need to come meet with Tampa Police, Orlando Police, Plant City, the Sheriff's Department over here, because they're getting invaded by MS-13 as we speak. I'm starting to see, I don't see them here where I'm at, but I know that in Tampa, that area, they're starting to migrate over here. But with that said, we still have a lot to cover. Tell me about these tattoos. Chicano gangs have always had the tattoos and the arms. Now they have them on the legs, they have them on the neck, but never in the face. But we're starting to see this new generation. But these guys started with these tattoos. Can you tell us why they tattoo their face? Is it a form of intimidation? Is it a religious belief? What is it? Why the face? Like these guys right here.
Right. So if I'm looking at the one guy with the cone, and the guy, you can see his face. That's an 18th Street gang member, not an MS-13 gang member. But they do the same thing, and basically that is a form of intimidation. I mean, you've heard stories about, well, if they have tattoos above their shoulder or on their face or whatever, it's showing that they have rank in the gang, or they've done something in the gang. Nothing that I've seen. Nothing. I'll get to the question in a minute, but nothing that I've seen corroborates that. Basically, it's if someone is dedicated enough. How many police officers do you know that are getting their department tattooed on their face? Even retired police officers, none. They're not that dedicated. They're not that into it. These guys are dedicated. They're 100% into it, and they're, you know, and I don't, crazy. I mean, they are very, very, very into that gang. Now, when you look at Central America, the majority of Central America is Catholic. So you have both of these gangs that almost act demonic at times. They have devil's horns. They'll have 666, the number of the beast. The MS hand sign is La Garra, or the claw, which is like devil's horns. It has the long pointy fingernails on it. That's all a form of intimidation, because the more, as a gang member, the more I can intimidate the population that I'm in, the more I can intimidate the people that live around me, the more control I have over them, the more power I have over them, the more money I can make. So it's about money, power, and control. That's generally why they get their faces tattooed. They're just 100% dedicated to that. I saw the question: Did I train with the police in Guatemala? I was never in Guatemala. That's one of the countries I haven't been in, but I have trained the PNC from Guatemala. They've come to our trainings. We have training every August in Las Vegas that we do. So we have a training coming up this August that usually has a population or a good number of Guatemalan, El Salvadoran, Honduran, Mexican officers that are vetted through the U.S., that are brought up through different manners, and that come to the training where we can teach them and they can teach us. I've also been down south to El Salvador a couple times, to Honduras, where I've done training there, and I've also received training from them. I've been taken around the countries and shown different areas and all. So I have done training with them. I've gotten training from them as well as given training to them.
Hey, George, prior to coming on live earlier today, you and I spoke. Thank you, Lindsay, for sending this recording to your colleagues at CBSA. Much appreciated, brother. But prior to coming on to the show, you talked about that you've done, well, not only talked about it, but I looked at your resume, outstanding resume. And you talk about that you did training for the CIA, for NASA. What type of training did they want and why?
The NSA and the CIA both wanted training on Central American gangs and predominantly Mara Salvatrucha, because they were directed from, the information that I got was they were directed from the White House to learn about who these organizations were. So depending on which agency you're talking about, depends on whether you're talking about within the United States or outside of the United States. But they were directed from above, from the White House, basically is the information I got, to learn about these organizations. And somehow or another reached out to me, which was very interesting for me to go and teach them. But, you know, it was very, I was honored to actually go do that.
Hey, Bobby, when I was working in Mexico as a PI and also for the PD intelligence, I did 10 years altogether. I traveled throughout Mexico. I never saw MS13 in Tijuana. I never saw them in Baja California. They might be there now, but I would hear, and I never saw them in Juarez, but I did see them. Well, I read about them in Tamaulipas. Can you tell us, Bobby? I know you were in Monterrey for many years. Can you tell us why they were over there?
Yeah, leading into that, before, and I mentioned it before in a prior podcast, the last 2 years of my career with PD, I was assigned to ICE doing human smuggling. I mentioned we had a house with 160 migrants in one house, 180 in another. And in the one with 180, I think there was only 27 Mexicanos in that house. Everybody else was Central American. Mm-hmm. And we found books that the smugglers had their point of contact, and like what you were mentioning, who was a point of contact? 180 people in one house. Kentucky, Tennessee, they were spelling it out phonetically. New Jersey, Virginia, different places. You could just see it. They were all going to get sent there. The Western Union money was going to come out to pay their transportation to go out. Well, after I leave there, I go to Mexico, and I go to a meeting in Zacatecas, to go meet the Procurador General, the State Attorney General. His office set up on a hill. And I go to meet him, and we're sitting up there, and I'm asking him about MS13 because the train tracks run right through there. The famous La Bestia, the beach that goes from Guatemala and travels all through Mexico. And as I ask him that, he goes, "Oh, funny that you mentioned." He looks at his watch. He goes, "Let's give it about 5 minutes because it'll go by." And we're talking, and all of a sudden, here comes the train. And there was people sitting up top of this train, what they call La Bestia, as it's heading north. It would get close to Tamaulipas. Some would jump off there and get smuggled. Most of them, I think, were getting smuggled across the Rio Grande. Later on, they were going west through Sonora, going to Tijuana, because later I was working as a journalist when I came back from Mexico. And in 2018, when the big giant caravans were showing up to Tijuana, where they had 4,000, 6,000 people there, as part of my reporting, I crossed into Tijuana, and I went to one of those shelters. It was an open air shelter, 4,000 people. I'm a gang cop. I started spotting the packs of MS13, 18 criminals. They were there. I walked up to several, and they had the tattoos. And I'd ask them, who were they with? Yo ando con la Mara. Yo ando con la 18. And they were there, but they were not going to cross, asking for asylum. They told me after they got fed and rested, they were going to go out into the desert and cross because you can no longer pretend that they were legal, honest, law-abiding citizens. They were going to have to enter illegally. But in Tamaulipas, the MS-13 was controlling at that time the train that was bringing all the people as they were going through with the permission of the Mexican organized crime and the Mexican drug cartels. They were having to pay a tax to them. And every now and then, if they didn't pay a tax, they were finding dead MS-13 members scattered throughout Mexico for not paying that transportation tax to Mexican organized crime. So we were encountering them in Tamaulipas, Zacatecas, San Luis Potosí.
Hey, Bobby, and the Zetas started using them also as assassins, correct?
Absolutely.
Zetas. Hey, George, we have a question from Lindsay Dennis, and he's talking about women that are members or involved with MS-13. Have you seen an increase of women using typical tactics, extortion specifically? Good question, Lindsay.
Yeah. So right before I answer that question, on that fact you were talking about with MS-13, why you didn't see them in Mexico, the way they kind of operate is, and I'll use, a state prison in Maryland, for example. The way they operate is when they go into the state prison, if they don't have a huge population in there, they can't really rep MS-13. They're going to conform to whatever the controlling Hispanic power is that's there. As we filled up the prisons here, they grew power, and once they felt like they had enough to branch out on their own, then they stepped up as Mara Salvatrucha and started attacking and extorting all of the other Hispanic prisoners that were within that prison system. Right. Same thing with the neighborhoods. If they don't have a big population, they're going to lay low and not identify themselves as Mara Salvatrucha. They're just going to try to blend in and lay low until they get the numbers up to where they actually can have a power or have control. With the women, the majority of women that are associated with MS-13 are not actually quote unquote members of the gang per se. They're more tools of the gang. They're the oxygen of the gang. They drive them places. They're the ones with the driver's license. They're the ones with the jobs. They're the ones with the information. They're the ones that can read and write better, can read and write English and or Spanish better. So they're the ones that are helping with the communication, helping with the transportation, helping with the function of the gang. There are some homegirls that are actual members of the gang, and a common tactic is to use women to bait in victims, whether they be rival gang members or people they perceive to be rival gang members, or whether they be, a rich businessman or something to extort. So they will get a girl, a cute girl, to befriend you two because you two on your social media may look like chavalas, or which is what the MS calls all rival gang members, chavalas. You look like rival gang members. You dress like them. So we're going to get this girl to befriend you, and then make you believe that she's going to hook up with you and get you to come out to a location, whether it be a park somewhere, whether it be a bar somewhere. And as you come out to that location, they are going to kill you because you're a chavala, you're a rival. And they will usually assign the younger, lower ranking members of the gang missions to do that violent attack because, one, they're juveniles, and two, they want to make sure that they're committed to the gang and commit this violent act in order to earn the next rank and earn the street cred within the gang, to show their loyalty to the gang. So they do use women. They use them for extortion. Extortion is huge, especially extorting Hispanic businesses. And I don't mean like large, corporations. I mean the mom and pop shops, the local taco or pupusa truck, the street vendors, the casitas, the putarias, the prostitution houses. All of those, if it's in an area controlled by MS13, they're all extorted and they're all paying money to Mara Salvatrucha. If they don't pay money, then they're victimized.
Hey, George, one of the things that Ruben mentioned in Mexico when I was working down there, when anybody would refer to MS13, they would always call them cerotes. And when I was working the joint, even back then in 84 through 88, when we started hearing about El Salvador, they were just getting started. They were also known, and today they're still known as cerotes in LA, Mexico, and especially in the prison system. But with that said, we're going to go ahead and segue into the next question. And Bobby, it's all yours. Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, talk to us about the Brenda Paz case, the Paz case, the Brenda Paz. That was one thing that I know got a lot of print here in the United States.
So Brenda Paz is probably one of the bigger publicized cases within MS13. She was made. Her case was made, even though it was many years later, was made more public by Donald Trump referring to that case about the Brenda Paz case, which caused people to look into it, caused the media to look into it more. But her case basically is she was a homegirl. She wasn't property of, or wasn't. She was actually a homegirl. Her dad was a gangster. She had moved from California to, I think, Texas, to Northern Virginia. And just before I go any further, to preface it, I was working MS, 10 miles from where the Brenda Paz case happened. I didn't work on the Brenda Paz case, but I worked with everybody that worked on that case, so I'm pretty familiar with it. So I don't want people thinking I'm claiming that I worked the case. I didn't work the case. I did not testify as an expert in that case either, actually. I think all of the Northern Virginia guys, the investigators, handled that. So Brenda Paz was a homegirl that was involved in a murder that happened on a small island in a national park in the Potomac River. They pretty much beheaded this person, and I'm summarizing this as best I can. She ultimately became an informant, a snitch for the police on that murder case. Now, I don't know how this happened, but she did a lot of interviews with law enforcement and explained how MS13 operates, showed their hand signs, the different structures, the rules, the regulations. Well, you can find all of them on YouTube now just by typing in Brenda Paz. I don't know how they got on YouTube. It bothers me. But one thing that she said was prophetic. I think 60 Minutes even said it, but she was on, I think it was 60 Minutes, her case and her interviews. And she basically said that sooner or later, MS13 is going to take care of business. MS13 never forgets. And that's something that she said herself in her interviews that she disregarded, because when she became an informant and when that case went through, she was entered into the Witness Protection Program. And they moved her to different states. Ultimately they moved to Maryland, then they moved her to like Minnesota, I think. But in order for you to be in witness protection, you have to cooperate. You have to not communicate with your friends and family and associates. She did not do this, and she ultimately returned to Northern Virginia, where it was already known that she was a snitch and she was testifying and she was an informant against MS13. And when she went back to Northern Virginia, she started hanging out with MS13 again. So MS13 ultimately basically took her in, acted like, yeah, everything's good, but assigned somebody basically as a quote-unquote bodyguard kind of thing. You watch her. That's your mission is you keep track of her. You wherever she goes, you go. You all hang out. She thought it was her friend. It was another homeboy she thought was her friend that she trusted. But he was a homeboy, and he was more loyal to the gang than her. So they were at a hotel. They woke up one morning. She was pregnant by another MS member, and they said, we're going to go fishing. They took her to the Shenandoah Valley, way out in the country, and by a stream where they were going to go fishing, and stabbed her to death, killing her and her unborn baby that's in her stomach. And she was prophetic because she said sooner or later MS13 is going to take care of business. They never forget. And she snitched on them. And she said that the punishment for snitching is death. But she was addicted to the lifestyle. And that's one thing I see a lot of times, not just with MS, but with kids and people with the gangsters lifestyle in general is you're involved with a gang. You're an adrenaline junkie. It's like being a police officer. You're an adrenaline junkie, and you're used to this adrenaline rushes on the police chasing you, and you fighting, enemies, and you're looking out for people killing you, and you're going to all these parties, and you're having a good time, and then if you go away and try to have a normal life, you get bored. You miss that adrenaline rush. You miss that excitement and fun, and I think that's what basically happened to her, and she disregarded her own words, and it ultimately got her killed. And I've seen that not just with the Brenda Paz case, but with cases that I've been involved with, more than I can count on these two hands. The same thing, almost the same thing happening, where the girls are just infatuated with this lifestyle, not necessarily the gang itself, but that lifestyle, the fast, fun, party lifestyle, and they can't get out of it. Even if I get them away, I get them back in school, I get their tattoos removed, I get them living in a different area. Next thing I know, I stop a car, and there's this girl that I've gotten out of the gang life back in the car with the gang members with new tattoos. And I'm like, what the hell? And she got bored at home, and that's what she said. She got bored at home. So it's almost like an addiction to the lifestyle that a lot of times we're battling as officers.
Hey, Bobby, real quick, let me just ask him this real question and then go ahead and jump on. What was so special, not special, violent about this case that it received national attention from our president, President Trump. When we see this in San Diego, I know, Bobby, you see it in I mean, not weekly, but we see it a lot in the Chicano neighborhoods in Phoenix. We see it in LA. Why was this case so special that it got national attention by our president?
Who, my opinion is, and I thought that too. Why did he pick the Brenda Paz case? One is its location, which is right next to
The White House,
right next to Washington D.C.
okay.
The murder scene is probably, if I were to guess, probably 3 or 4 miles from the White House. So if someone is advising the president and they're looking for a case to bring up, what better than that case? Now, that case was on 60 Minutes. That case was in national news years before, right after it happened, but then it kind of faded out. And then President Trump brought it back up again when he mentioned it. During that same time when he's mentioning that, in Maryland, we had a body that was found where MS13 stabbed this guy to death and cut his heart out and took a bite out of this guy's heart. We've had cases where
I don't think we've had those in Chicano neighborhoods, right, Bobby? They eat a guy's heart out.
But if you look at, well, that's why MS was so.
Yeah.
That's how they gained their power so fast, because you had Americanized, and I don't mean American, but I mean Americanized gangsters. So you have street gang members, Buds, Crips, the Chicano street gangs that are more Americanized. Yeah, they'll fight you, they'll beat you to death, they'll shoot you. But it's a lot different shooting somebody than stabbing somebody like 180 times. Until you can't even recognize that it's a body, or butchering them into 6, 7, 8 different pieces and piling their body pieces up in a hole in the ground, which is literally stuff that I've seen. It's a lot different. It's a totally different third world kind of ultra violence that the Americanized gangsters were not used to. So when you look at the Mexican cartels, how do they I go back to control. You control with fear and intimidation. Fear and intimidation get you power. Power gets you money. So you control with fear and intimidation. Well, we're going to do this ultra violence, and it causes fear and intimidation. People are scared the hell out of people. They're scared to death of us as MS-13 members. You look at ISIS, and you look at when they're burning people alive in cages, and they're literally torturing people and putting their videos out. The Mexican cartels are butchering people with chainsaws or in acid. Like, whoever has the most heinous, sickening violence that you could think of, they're doing that for the intimidation factor. Because the intimidation factor causes you, when you're the citizen and you see me do something, you're not saying shit. Because you're scared to death of me. You don't want your family boiled to death in battery acid or butchered to death in the streets.
Put in a suitcase. Yeah.
So I control you by fear and intimidation. So this ultra violence, this third world rudimentary, violence, is a form of intimidation and control of the areas that they're in. But I've seen it not just the Brenda Paz case, but again, I've seen it, in Annapolis, Maryland. You have a girl that's basically cut. Her body is cut up. A high school girl. Her body is cut up into several different pieces, and she's put into a grave only because they saw her on social media, and it looked like she was standing with a guy that was a rival gang member, which is not true. But to them, the guy she posed with in a picture on her social media page looked like a rival gang member. So that was good enough to them, where they had a girl befriend her, go to a party, and then bring her out and butcher her to death and cut her body up into pieces and bury her in the ground. It's crazy ultra violence.
Hey, Bobby, go ahead, brother.
One of the things I always try to explain it this way, but you're explaining about the ultra violence. U.S. born, raised gangsters compared to someone born in a third world country. whether it's someone in a Latin American country, some hipster guy going to USC or UCLA, meet somebody from, Gaza or Iraq, Afghanistan, and they meet
Africa.
from there. Yeah, Africa, U.S. born. They meet him at a hookah bar and they think, oh, he's pretty cool. You have no idea. He's U.S. born. You have no idea how life is in Iraq, how life is in some of these other countries, Latin American countries, Africa, where you're dealing with a totally different person. That's the violence that we used to joke when I was in Mexico. I was there for 3 years. Some of the cartel murders where they would grab a rival and torture and dismember and do all kinds of crazy things. We would joke.
Peel their face off.
Peel their face off and stitch it onto a soccer ball.
Right.
Yeah.
Play soccer.
Right.
Yeah.
What a waste of a soccer ball. Come on, don't do that. But anyway, we would say, we're like, when they were doing stuff like this, we were joking in Mexico in meetings, like, there got to be some ISIS people that are maybe moderate, if there's such thing, going outrage at the extreme violence and senseless violence going on in Mexico. They did that for what? Because life in the third world, life in other countries is totally different than people U.S. born, U.S. bred. And that's why I followed a lot of the cases that were going in New York, Long Island, and Virginia, Maryland, where they were luring people, rivals, to a park and with machetes killing somebody, not shooting them, machetazos, and then burying them in shallow graves.
Right.
I mean, horrific death, really. It's horrible.
And
Hey guys, we got a quick pause. Special word from our sponsor. When what then shall say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Romans 8:31. Beautiful scripture.
Yes.
Go ahead.
so I was going to follow up on that real quick.
Mm-hmm.
The way I kind of explain that is they become callous towards that type of violence, whereas other people are not. They're not callous towards that violence. It means something. When I have a 15-year-old kid that stabs a 17-year-old kid to death, and in an interview, and you're talking to this kid, and you're like, well, when you stabbed him, did he say anything? And he's like, yeah, he was screaming for his mother. But when the 15-year-old answers, he has like no remorse or no emotion or nothing in his body. He doesn't give a shit. It's because he's basically a murder robot. If you are raised on a farm, and every day as a kid you go out with your mom and butcher a chicken, and that's how you were raised. When you're an adult now, and I say, "Oh, we need to eat. We need to butcher this chicken," you could do it because you were raised around that kind of act. Somebody that never butchered a chicken was going to be like, "Fuck you! I'm going to Popeyes. I'm going to Giant or Safeway. I'm going to grocery store. I'm not butchering that chicken. I'm going to go buy some chicken somewhere." The brain, like a brain surgeon, the first, they can test all they want on simulators and stuff like that, but the first brain surgery that a brain surgeon does, when they cut the skull open on a human and are actually working on a live human, it's got to be traumatic and totally different than the 50th one they've done, because they become callous towards that act. As police officers, the first murder dead body that you see, the decomp that you see, can be traumatic to you. But 20 years later, and you're like eating Cheetos, going, "All right, yeah, that guy had his head cut off." It happens. It's shit that we see all the time, because you become callous towards that violence.
Right.
So when you have kids that grow up in Central America or other places that have that third world violence, parts of Africa and the Middle East and stuff, they become callous towards that violence. It's the same way that kids that grow up in the inner cities of the United States that see the murders every day, that their friends are killed every day, they become callous towards the violence, and they're more prone to doing the violence or not really being affected by that violence. So you have these kids that become, callous towards this ultra violence, through just living life in the area that they're living in. And that's a problem. We had an MS13 meeting in one of our cases that we recorded, audio recorded. And a guy came from El Salvador, leadership came from El Salvador, and they have this meeting. And in this meeting, the leadership from El Salvador is saying, and this is a regional meeting for the Washington metropolitan area, each clique has to go out and kill 2 chavalas a month, and blah, 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 blah. You have to do more bombings and get into more businesses. Talking about firebombing places and doing more crime, getting more violent, killing people. And then he steps away, and we literally hear the Americanized gang members in MS13 going, this guy's fucking crazy, man. There's no way law enforcement is going to allow us. And they're doing the math. If you think about it, we have 7 cliques right now, and if each of us kill 2 people, that's 14 people a month. There's no way that the police are going to allow that. We're never going to be able to do that here. We're not going to be able to firebomb places, because the guy from Central America, that's what they do every day. Yeah. Law enforcement up here is different. They have different, we have a little bit more control over what's going on. I mean, it's totally different down south. But that's the difference in the mindset. Like he was saying, that's the difference in the mindset. The guys from down south have a totally different, level of violence and how they act than the guys that are more Americanized from the U.S. So when we have a body that's stabbed 75 times, your first reaction is, if it's not a crime of passion like a domestic, which the crime of passion is, a lot of times is ultra violent, you start thinking about, okay, who is this? ISIS? MS-13? Who does this kind of violence? Who stabs a body 132 times? So that's kind of one of the signatures of MS-13 is that ultra hyper violence.
Hey, George, right now time is against us. We're over our hour, and we could go on and on, but I'll tell you, knowing our statistics, people stop watching. So we want you to come back if you're available. Maybe in about 3 weeks, Bobby and I will sit down with Doug and we'll look at some time. When you come back, I want to talk about the mindset of MS-13 compared to an East LA gang member, to a San Diego gang member, to a gang member from Phoenix. And I want to break down the mindset. I also want to break down the terrorist tactics that they're bringing from South America. And I also want to break down the terrorists, them becoming terrorists, Al-Qaeda reaching out to them, and how can they reach out, and how prevalent are they to work for them, because they have no love for America. Right. So we want to come back. And Bobby, what else do you want to cover in a couple of weeks with him?
No, just what you're talking about. You're mentioning the people become callous to that. And I've mentioned in a prior podcast.
Thanks, Benny.
Tijuana, Juarez, some of these border cities. Tijuana had 2,500 homicides a few years back. Juarez, Juarez is Juarez. When I worked in Mexico, I knew they only solved maybe 5% of their homicides. So you have mass murderers running around, get up, and all they do is they're going to go out and kill. I can't imagine some of the body counts, and they're more likely to get killed, to get whacked by a rival, than to be arrested. That's pretty much life down in some of these places. The same thing we saw. I worked in Haiti. In Haiti, 2% to 5% of homicides get investigated. The rest are kind of like civil matters. Just hand the body to the family, and the families are going to take care of it later. So that's life in the third world.
And George, Jim DeJanis, by the way, he has his own show called Batman, great show on YouTube. He's watching us all the way from Thailand right now.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and you know what? He worked in Pelican Bay, I believe, for 22, 24 years. He opened Pelican Bay, and he was on the security squad. Outstanding. And Sergeant Mueller, who was on earlier, he's another legend from National City PD. I believe it's him that it's a long story. We heard of his story last night. He's currently living in the Philippines regarding Hector Ayala. Very interesting story. So you got people from right now, Philippines watching you. You got Jim from Thailand. So brother, I'll tell you what, you're going to definitely come back. And I know Benny, is dying to get you on the Gray Line, but you're going to give us a part 2, and then you're going to go to Gray Line. And man, we're honored to have you, brother. Thank you.
Appreciate y'all having me here. I'll just give a shout out to the International Latino Gang Investigators Association. We have a conference coming up in August. If you go to www.ilgiaonline.org, the information is there. Law enforcement is allowed to attend. It'll be a great conference. There'll be people from Central America there as well as Mexico. So,
brother, you're going to come on way before that, and we're going to really publicize it on the show. Brother, okay. And I also want to talk about what you're doing now, but I don't want to mention it because I want everybody to be surprised. Man, you are without a doubt, man, a hero, brother. We'll see you. Bobby, any last words for George?
No, I was excited when I saw your resume, so I couldn't wait to get started with this show, and looking forward to talking to you offline.
Right on.
Great job, bro. Great job.
Hey, thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you, brother. All right, we'll talk soon. All right.
Hold on.
Hey, Bobby, man, talking about an expert, huh? Knowing the subject matter, working with these guys. Right. Very interesting. Yeah.
Super interesting. Yes. Love the show.
Hey, Bobby, but listen, next week, time's not on our side. We're at an hour, 11 minutes. But next week, we got the warden from St. Quentin. We got the legend, Danny Vasquez. I don't know why I keep saying Hernandez. I guess it's part of the dementia at 64 years old, right? But Danny Vasquez is going to be with us next week. And the show, next week, Bobby, it's going to be about legends. He's going to talk about the legends that he had the honor to work with. He's going to break them down. Law enforcement legends, community legends. So it's going to be a great show. I'm really looking forward having Danny Vasquez next week. It's going to be a great show. Great show. With that said, Bobby, any last words, brother?
Thanks everyone for joining, and till next week. We'll see you all next week, and have a great week. A blessed week.
And also, happy Memorial Day, and thank you for all that sacrificed their life for each and one of us to have the freedom and to have this show today. Thank you. Have a great weekend. Happy Memorial Day. God bless you.
No hay método escrito, a mi modo he cometido errores, pero de ellos aprendí poquito. He aprendido a llorar en la vida y también a gozarla bonito. A mi modo he llevado la vida, así pienso seguirla llevando. A mi modo aprendí de mujeres, poco a poco me he ido enseñando, unas veces gozando con ellas y otras veces por ellas llorando. A mi modo que sea mi sepelio, que se siga